issue that we chose to discuss was a disparity in success rates between Africans and the African diaspora and African Americans in America, and how that contributes to feelings of alienation and animosity between the groups. Looking at Black Americans and African-born immigrants that immigrated to the U.S. as two separate groups instead of lumping them into one category, you can see that there are notable disparities in both educational attainment and wealth. Specifically, the Pew Research Center found that 40% of sub-Saharan African immigrants hold a bachelor's degree or higher, while the American Center of Education found that only 15% of Black Americans hold a bachelor's degree or higher. Now, in terms of wealth, the disparity isn't that great, but it's still notable, as 22% of sub-Saharan African immigrants lived in poverty, according to the Center for Immigration Studies, while 25% of Black Americans lived in poverty, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. Our group's issue has its roots in three primary causes. The first being conflicting social categorizations, because African immigrants, since they know their ancestry and national origin, they tend to define themselves based on their national origin. For example, saying they're Somali American or Nigerian American, whereas Black Americans don't necessarily know which country they originated from because of slavery. And secondly, the Eurocentric nature of the U.S. This has led to the U.S. education system downplaying any African achievements while emphasizing European accomplishments.
A lack of understanding, both culturally and historically, between African Americans and Africans has limited the amount of communications they have with one another, allowing stereotypes and biases to fuel the everyday tension and hostility. Africans choose to remove themselves from African Americans as to not be affiliated with negative stereotypes associated with the group, while African Americans tend to see Africans as believing that they are better because of their ancestry. Black Americans in Africa, a critique of the Pan-African and identity paradigms, explores what it means to be a Pan-African, as well as why the Black community struggles to unite. It also explains why using Pan-Africanism to combat Eurocentralism is an issue when trying to lump culturally and historically different people under one label. African American, Black Caribbean, and non-Hispanic white feelings of closeness conducted a survey sampling people of different racial groups. They found that African Americans do not feel a strong bond towards Africans but have a racial solidarity, all the while feeling a closeness to whites and ethnic blacks. I Am Blacker Than You, theorizing conflict between African immigrants and African Americans in the United States, explained how African immigrants are using the immigrant identity to fill the gap between ethnic self and racial self in America by using terms such as Nigerian American. By doing this, they reduce the negativity and lack of opportunities associated with being African American. African Americans views this as them being rejected, causing animosity between the groups. This article goes in depth of how the number of Nigerian Americans with master's degrees, as well as entering the education and health field in the United States, has increased. It focuses on the Onyejikwu's family's success, which they say is due to cultural expectations and the importance of education. Black immigrants, specifically Africans, are traveling to the United States to get an education. Immigrants are also creating businesses, helping to keep money in the community. Although African Americans have to battle socioeconomic and psychological racism, there is hope that income growth rates in the Black household will allow both immigrant and Native Black people to recognize their economic ability.
To conclude, there is a huge chasm between African Americans and African immigrants in the U.S. that has been widening over the years. It has prevented African Americans from participating in the current economic boom in Africa. The problem stems from deep misconceptions, oftentimes fueled by the U.S. media. Some African Americans believe that Africans are backward and primitive. Some make crude jokes about Africans or don't acknowledge the great contributions Africa has made to the world. Some African immigrants buy into the erroneous notion that African Americans are lazy and violent. They don't appreciate the great sacrifices that African Americans have made. They had to deal with. African cultures, Nigeria specifically, highlights the importance of learning. A typical Nigerian saying goes, "The best inheritance that a parent can give you is not jewelry or cash or material things, it is a good education." This is why academics in Nigeria are widely supported, mandatory, and free. Meanwhile, in America, native-born Black students grow up in a much more stressful and unstable environment, which translates to academic struggles. African immigrants don't have to deal with negative labels, such as bad kids, that Black students have to deal with. So what are some solutions? Well, African Americans should have their own racial category called ADOS, or American Descendants of Slavery. This allows them to have their own racial category on census forms and college applications and not be lumped in with others with similar skin color but vastly different lived experiences. Also, this will help the federal government to prioritize African Americans whose ancestors toiled in bondage. Also, understanding each other's plight and respecting each other is key for both sides. Refusing to acknowledge someone's story or struggle because of how they made you feel upon first interaction isn't progressive and hinders the ability to forgive and forge new lines of understanding. Both sides have to ask questions, hold each other accountable, while also empathizing with one another. African immigrants have their own stories, culture, and things to teach their peers, but they want to feel respected and accepted. African Americans have their own culture, stories, and things to teach their peers, but they don't want or need to be judged or painted with a single stroke.
Other people argue that African immigrants and Black people may have different experiences, but the physicality of race makes both groups Black. For example, Africans describe being racially profiled by the police, and their accent does not change the outcome of how they're treated. So race or experience, what would you say makes someone Black and why? Both African immigrants and Black people do not understand where the other group is coming from. Africans tend to buy into the narrative that Blacks are lazy and violent. Blacks tend to believe that Africans are primitive and backwards. Besides the media, why do you think these narratives are so prevalent in these communities? Do you think this category is a good idea? How do you think it will affect both populations? Will it make it easier for Black needs to be catered to, or will it highlight the divide between the population?